long before the thunder of American tanks rolled across the battlefields of Europe. George Smith Patton, Jr. had already begun shaping the reputation that would one day make him one of the most recognizable commanders of the Second World War. Born in 1885 in San Gabriel, California, Patton grew up surrounded by stories of war, courage, and military tradition. His family history was filled with soldiers who had fought in earlier American conflicts, and from an early age, he believed that his own destiny would follow the same path. For Patton, war was not merely a profession. It was a calling that demanded discipline, ambition, and an unwavering belief in victory. As a young man, Patton pursued that calling with relentless determination. He attended the United States Military Academy at West Point, where he developed a reputation for both fierce competitiveness and uncompromising standards. Though he struggled academically at first, Patton refused to allow failure to define him. He pushed himself physically and mentally, becoming an accomplished athlete and an officer who believed that leadership required both strength and example. Even during these early years, Patton displayed the traits that would later define his wartime command: boldness, confidence, and a powerful belief that decisive action could change the course of battle. The First World War offered Patton his first real experience of modern combat. Assigned to the newly developing field of armored warfare, he became one of the early advocates of tanks as a revolutionary weapon on the battlefield. While many traditional officers remained skeptical of these slow and mechanical machines, Patton saw their potential immediately. He believed tanks could break the deadlock of trench warfare by combining mobility, firepower, and shock. During the brutal campaigns in France, he helped organize and lead American tank units in combat, gaining valuable experience that would shape his understanding of mechanized warfare for decades to come. By the time the Second World War erupted in 1939, Patton had spent years studying military history, strategy, and the future of armored combat. He believed that the next great war would be fast, aggressive, and dominated by mobile armored forces. When the United States entered the conflict in 1941, Patton was ready. The world was about to witness the rise of a commander whose aggressive leadership, fiery personality, and relentless pursuit of victory would earn him a reputation that echoed across every battlefield he entered: America's unstoppable general. When the United States entered the Second World War, after the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, the American military faced an enormous challenge. The nation possessed vast industrial potential and millions of volunteers ready to serve, but its army was still inexperienced in large-scale modern warfare. Many American units had trained hard, yet few officers had commanded massive mechanized forces in real combat. The coming war would demand leaders capable of moving armies across continents, coordinating tanks, aircraft, artillery, and infantry with speed and precision. Among the officers preparing for that challenge, George S. Patton stood out immediately. Patton believed deeply in aggressive warfare. To him, hesitation on the battlefield meant defeat. During the early months of America's mobilization, he worked relentlessly to transform American armored forces into a powerful and disciplined striking weapon. As commander of armored training units in the United States, he pushed soldiers through grueling exercises designed to simulate the chaos of real combat. Tank crews practiced rapid maneuvers across open terrain. Artillery units trained to support fast-moving attacks, and officers were taught to make quick decisions under pressure. Patton demanded absolute discipline from his men, But he also inspired fierce loyalty by sharing their hardships and demonstrating the same relentless energy he expected from them. By 1942, the United States was preparing to enter the European and Mediterranean theaters of war. American leaders decided that the first major ground campaign against Axis forces would take place in North Africa. The operation, known as Operation Torch, would land Allied troops along the coast of Morocco and Algeria, opening a new front against German and Italian forces already fighting the British in the desert. It was a risky and complex plan that required careful coordination between naval fleets, air forces, and ground armies. Success would depend heavily on the leadership of commanders capable of acting decisively in unfamiliar conditions. Patton was selected to play a key role in this historic operation. Promoted to command American forces during the landings in Morocco, he prepared his troops with intense focus. For Patton, this moment represented far more than a military assignment. It was the beginning of America's full return to the great battlefields of Europe. Soon, the aggressive commander who had spent years preparing for modern armored warfare would lead his soldiers into their first major confrontation with Axis forces. The war that Patton had studied and anticipated for decades was finally beginning. In November 1942, the Allied plan to strike Axis forces in North Africa finally moved from strategy rooms to the open sea. Operation Torch would become the first large-scale American ground campaign of the war against German forces. Hundreds of ships carrying tens of thousands of soldiers crossed the Atlantic under heavy protection from Allied naval fleets. Their destination was the coastline of French North Africa, Morocco, and Algeria, territories controlled by the Vichy French government, which maintained a complicated and uncertain relationship with both the Axis and the Allies. The landings would be a critical test for the young American army. General George S. Patton was given command of the Western Task Force, responsible for the amphibious landings along the Moroccan coast near Casablanca. It was a massive undertaking. Troop transports, warships, landing craft, tanks, and artillery had to coordinate their movements with absolute precision. Amphibious warfare on this scale was still a relatively new concept, and many soldiers had never experienced combat before. Patton understood that the success of the operation depended on speed and determination. Any delay on the beaches could allow enemy forces to regroup and counterattack. As the Allied fleets approached the coast on November 8, 1942, the tension among the soldiers was immense. Landing craft moved through the early morning darkness toward the beaches, carrying infantry units ready to establish the first footholds on North African soil. Patton himself remained aboard his flagship, carefully monitoring the progress of the landings while issuing orders through a constant stream of radio communication. Although resistance from some Vichy French forces complicated the operation, Allied troops gradually secured their landing zones and began pushing inland. The success of Operation Torch marked a turning point for the American Army. For the first time in the Second World War, large numbers of U.S. troops were engaged directly in combat operations against Axis forces in the Mediterranean theater. For Patton, the landings represented the beginning of his rise as one of the most dynamic commanders of the war. The campaign in North Africa would soon place him face to face with experienced German forces, and the aggressive leadership style that defined Patton would soon be tested in the harsh reality of the battlefield. After the success of Operation Torch, The Allied advance across North Africa quickly brought American forces into direct confrontation with experienced German and Italian armies. The campaign moved eastward toward Tunisia, where Axis forces were regrouping to defend their remaining positions in North Africa. For many American soldiers, this would be their first encounter with the hardened veterans of the German army, troops who had already fought across Europe and the deserts of Libya and Egypt. The coming battles would prove that enthusiasm alone could not replace battlefield experience. Early clashes in Tunisia revealed serious weaknesses in the American army. Units that had trained intensively in the United States suddenly found themselves facing coordinated attacks from German armored divisions supported by artillery and aircraft. Command structures were still adjusting to the pressures of real combat, and communication between units sometimes broke down under the stress of battle. In several engagements, German forces exploited these weaknesses with devastating efficiency, forcing American units to retreat and regroup. These early setbacks shocked Allied commanders. The reality of modern mechanized warfare was far harsher than many had anticipated. The desert terrain allowed armored formations to maneuver quickly, striking vulnerable points in the defensive lines and disrupting supply routes. German commanders used speed and coordination to isolate Allied positions, forcing them into chaotic withdrawals. The lessons were painful, but necessary. The American army had entered the war with determination, but now it had to learn how to fight effectively against one of the most experienced military forces in the world. In the midst of this difficult situation, George S. Patton was called upon to restore discipline and confidence among the American troops. His reputation for strict leadership and relentless energy made him the ideal choice to reorganize the struggling forces. Patton believed that victory required not only better tactics, but also a transformation in the mindset of the soldiers themselves. Under his command, training intensified, discipline tightened, and the army began preparing for the next phase of the North African campaign. The lessons learned in Tunisia would soon shape the fighting spirit of the American army for the rest of the war. In early 1943, the situation for American forces in Tunisia had reached a critical point. A series of difficult battles had exposed weaknesses in training, coordination, and leadership. German forces had demonstrated their experience and tactical flexibility, forcing American units into several costly retreats. Allied command realized that changes were necessary if the campaign in North Africa was to succeed. To restore order and confidence, a new commander was appointed to take charge of the U.S. Second Corps, a general known as much for his fierce discipline as for his bold leadership, George S. Patton. From the moment Patton arrived at headquarters, his presence was unmistakable. He believed that the Army's problems were not only tactical, but psychological. Soldiers needed to believe they could defeat the enemy, and that belief had to begin with discipline. Patton immediately introduced strict new standards. Uniforms had to be worn correctly at all times. Weapons had to be clean and ready for action. Officers were expected to lead from the front, and every soldier was reminded that hesitation on the battlefield could cost lives. His methods were demanding, but they quickly transformed the atmosphere within the ranks. Patton also reorganized the way American units operated on the battlefield. He emphasized speed, communication, and coordination between armored forces, infantry, and artillery. Tank commanders were trained to maneuver aggressively rather than remaining stationary targets. Artillery units practiced rapid support fire to protect advancing troops. Patton studied the tactics used by German commanders and pushed his officers to think just as quickly and decisively. His goal was clear. American forces would not simply defend themselves, they would take the initiative. The effect of Patton's leadership soon became visible across the front lines. Morale improved as soldiers regained confidence in their ability to fight and win. Training exercises became more intense, preparing units for the kind of fast-moving battles that defined the North African campaign. Patton's aggressive style inspired many troops while intimidating others, but no one doubted his determination. The American army that had struggled during its first encounters with German forces was rapidly evolving into a far more capable fighting force. Soon, Patton would lead these soldiers into the battles that would prove their strength. Under George S. Patton's command, the American forces in Tunisia began to transform. The early defeats that had shaken confidence were slowly replaced by renewed determination and sharper coordination on the battlefield. Patton believed that the key to defeating experienced German units was not simply strength in numbers, but speed, discipline, and relentless pressure. Training intensified across the front. Tank crews drilled endlessly in rapid maneuver, artillery units practiced coordinated fire support, and infantry units learned to move alongside armored formations with precision. The desert battlefield of Tunisia demanded adaptability. Rocky hills and narrow passes replaced the open sands that had characterized earlier fighting in Libya and Egypt. These new conditions forced commanders to rethink their tactics. Patton encouraged his officers to study the terrain carefully and use it to their advantage. Instead of waiting for German forces to attack, American units began launching their own aggressive operations, probing enemy defenses and forcing Axis troops to react rather than dictate the pace of battle. Gradually, the balance of power began to shift. Allied forces, strengthened by reinforcements and improved coordination, pushed forward across the rugged landscape. German and Italian units found themselves under increasing pressure from multiple directions as British forces advanced from the east, while American and Allied troops pressed from the west. Supply lines for the Axis armies grew increasingly fragile, and the once dominant German formations were now forced to fight a defensive campaign against a growing coalition of Allied forces. For Patton, these developments confirmed his belief that bold leadership and disciplined troops could overcome even the most experienced enemy. The American soldiers who had once struggled in their first encounters with German forces were now fighting with growing confidence. Each successful engagement strengthened their belief that they could stand toe-to-toe with the armies of the Axis. The campaign in Tunisia was becoming more than just a battle for territory. It was the proving ground where the modern American army was being forged in war. By the spring of 1943, the Allied campaign in North Africa was approaching its decisive conclusion. Axis forces in Tunisia were now trapped between advancing Allied armies moving from multiple directions. British forces pushed westward after their victories in Egypt and Libya, while American and Allied units advanced steadily from Algeria. The once powerful Axis position in North Africa was shrinking rapidly as supply routes collapsed and reinforcements became impossible to deliver across the increasingly dangerous Mediterranean. For George S. Patton and the American forces under his command, the campaign had become a powerful demonstration of how quickly an army could evolve under the pressure of war. Only months earlier, American units had struggled against experienced German troops in their first encounters with modern mechanized warfare. Now, those same units were participating in a coordinated offensive that steadily pushed Axis forces into an ever-tightening pocket. The lessons learned during the early battles in Tunisia were being applied across the front with increasing effectiveness. The terrain of northern Tunisia presented a final challenge. Rugged hills, narrow valleys, and fortified defensive positions created difficult conditions for advancing armies. Yet Allied forces continued to press forward with determination. Tank formations maneuvered through the valleys, while infantry units secured strategic high ground overlooking the remaining Axis positions. Artillery fire echoed across the hills as the Allied armies tightened their grip on the trapped enemy forces. In May 1943, the North African campaign came to its dramatic end. Surrounded and cut off from escape, large numbers of German and Italian troops were forced to surrender. The Allied victory in North Africa marked the first major defeat of Axis forces on land during the war. For the United States, it was also a moment of transformation. The American Army had entered the campaign inexperienced, but emerged as a confident and capable fighting force. And among the commanders who had helped guide that transformation, George S. Patton had firmly established himself as one of the most aggressive and determined leaders of the Allied war effort. In the summer of 1943, the Allied war effort shifted toward a new and ambitious objective, the invasion of Sicily. After the victory in North Africa, Allied leaders believed the next step was to strike directly at the southern edge of Axis-controlled Europe. Sicily, located at the heart of the Mediterranean, was the key. Whoever controlled the island could dominate vital sea lanes and open the door to mainland Italy. For the Allies, capturing Sicily would weaken Axis power in the region and create a new front that Germany would be forced to defend. The operation, known as Operation Husky, would become one of the largest amphibious assaults of the war up to that point. Thousands of ships gathered across the Mediterranean, carrying soldiers, tanks, artillery, and vast amounts of equipment. Aircraft filled the skies as Allied planners prepared for coordinated landings along the island's southern coast. Among the commanders leading this massive invasion was George S. Patton, now in command of the U.S. 7th Army. For Patton, the campaign would provide another opportunity to demonstrate his aggressive style of warfare. When the invasion began in July 1943, Allied forces landed along multiple beaches under difficult conditions. Strong winds scattered airborne units, and rough seas complicated the movement of landing craft. Despite these obstacles, the Allied armies established their footholds and began pushing inland. Patton's 7th Army moved rapidly across the western side of the island, capturing towns and strategic positions while engaging German and Italian defenders who attempted to slow the Allied advance. As the campaign progressed, Patton's aggressive leadership became increasingly visible. He pushed his forces forward with speed and determination, often urging his commanders to seize opportunities before the enemy could react. His troops advanced across rugged hills and narrow roads, sometimes covering remarkable distances in short periods of time. The race for control of Sicily had begun, and Patton intended to ensure that American forces played a decisive role in the island's capture. As the Allied invasion of Sicily unfolded in the summer of 1943, the campaign quickly turned into a race across the island. British forces under General Bernard Montgomery advanced along the eastern coastline toward the strategic city of Messina, while George S. Patton's U.S. Seventh Army pushed across the western and central regions of the island. Although the original plan had assigned American forces a supporting role, Patton believed his army could achieve far more. Determined to prove the strength of American armored warfare, he began driving his troops forward with relentless speed. The terrain of Sicily presented numerous challenges. Unlike the open deserts of North Africa, the island was dominated by rugged mountains, narrow roads, and ancient towns built along steep hillsides. German and Italian forces used these natural defenses to slow the Allied advance, establishing strong defensive positions along ridges and mountain passes. Each village and valley could become a small battlefield, forcing advancing troops to coordinate carefully between infantry, tanks, and artillery. Patton refused to allow these obstacles to halt his momentum. His strategy emphasized rapid maneuver, bypassing strong points whenever possible and striking deeper into enemy-held territory. American armored columns moved swiftly along the island's road network, capturing key ports and cutting off retreat routes for Axis forces. One of the most dramatic moments of the campaign came when Patton ordered a rapid drive toward Palermo, the capital of western Sicily. In a bold operation, American forces captured the city in late July 1943, securing a major logistical hub and strengthening the Allied position on the island. As the campaign continued, Patton's army pushed steadily toward Messina, the final objective of the invasion. German commanders, recognizing the danger of encirclement, began withdrawing their forces across the narrow Strait of Messina toward mainland Italy. Although many Axis troops managed to escape, the capture of Sicily represented a major strategic victory for the Allies. For Patton, the campaign further reinforced his reputation as a commander who believed that speed, aggression, and decisive action could overwhelm even the most determined defenses. Despite the success of the Sicilian campaign, George S. Patton's career soon entered one of its most controversial chapters. Patton was known not only for his bold leadership, but also for his fiery personality and uncompromising expectations. He demanded absolute courage and discipline from his soldiers, believing that fear and hesitation could destroy an army in battle. While many troops admired his determination and energy, others found his leadership style harsh and intimidating. During the campaign in Sicily in 1943, an incident occurred that would spark widespread controversy. While visiting field hospitals near the front lines, Patton encountered soldiers suffering from what was then commonly referred to as battle fatigue, a psychological condition caused by the intense stress of prolonged combat. At the time, understanding of combat trauma was limited, and many officers struggled to interpret these symptoms correctly. In a moment that would later become infamous, Patton angrily confronted one of the soldiers, accusing him of cowardice. News of the incident quickly spread through Allied command. Military leaders recognized Patton's value as a battlefield commander, but they also understood that such actions could damage morale and public confidence in the army. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander, decided that Patton would need to step away temporarily from active frontline command. Although the decision disappointed Patton deeply, he accepted the consequences and remained determined to continue serving in the war effort. For several months, Patton was removed from major combat operations, while Allied leaders prepared the next stage of the war in Europe. Yet even during this period, his reputation as one of the most aggressive armored commanders of the Allied forces remained intact. Many soldiers and officers believed that Patton's skills would soon be needed again on the battlefield. As the Allies prepared for the massive invasion of Western Europe, the stage was being set for Patton's return, and for some of the most dramatic operations of the entire war. By early 1944, Allied planners were preparing for one of the most ambitious military operations in history, the invasion of Nazi-occupied Western Europe. The operation, later known as D-Day, would require the landing of massive armies along the coast of France. Success depended not only on military strength, but also on deception. If German commanders correctly predicted the landing location, they could concentrate their defenses and potentially push the invasion back into the sea. Because of this, Allied intelligence developed an elaborate deception campaign designed to mislead German forces about where the invasion would occur. This plan, known as Operation Fortitude, relied heavily on the reputation of George S. Patton. German intelligence believed Patton to be the Allies' most aggressive and capable battlefield commander. Many German officers assumed that when the invasion of Europe began, Patton would lead the main assault. The Allies exploited this belief brilliantly. Patton was assigned to command a fictional formation known as the 1st U.S. Army Group, FUSAG. On paper, it appeared to be a massive army preparing to invade France across the narrow Strait of Dover toward the Pas-de-Calais region, the point where Britain and France are closest. To support the deception, Allied forces created dummy tanks, inflatable aircraft, fake radio transmissions, and simulated troop movements that convinced German reconnaissance that a huge invasion force was gathering. For Patton, the assignment was frustrating but crucial. As a commander eager to return to combat, he had to remain publicly associated with the fake army while the real invasion preparations continued elsewhere. Yet his presence played a vital role in the deception. German commanders remained convinced that Patton would lead the primary Allied attack. As a result, even after Allied forces landed in Normandy on June 6, 1944, many German units continued waiting near Pas-de-Calais, expecting a second and larger invasion led by Patton. The deception had worked, and soon Patton would finally return to the battlefield for real. By the summer of 1944, Allied forces had successfully established their foothold in Normandy after the historic landings on June 6th. Yet the fighting that followed was far from easy. The dense hedgerow countryside of northern France created a maze of narrow lanes, thick vegetation, and fortified German positions that slowed the Allied advance. Weeks of intense combat passed as American, British, and Canadian forces struggled to push beyond the beaches and break through the German defensive lines. It was in this critical moment that George S. Patton returned to frontline command. In August 1944, he was placed in charge of the newly activated U.S. Third Army, a powerful armored formation designed to exploit any breakthrough in the German defenses. Patton had waited months for the opportunity to command in battle again, and when the chance finally arrived, he moved with extraordinary speed. The breakthrough came with Operation Cobra, an Allied offensive designed to shatter the German lines west of St. Lo. After a massive aerial bombardment weakened German defenses, American forces surged forward, creating a gap in the enemy front. Patton's Third Army was unleashed into that opening like a spearhead. Tank columns and mechanized infantry raced across the French countryside, advancing far faster than German commanders had anticipated. Patton's strategy relied on relentless momentum. Instead of pausing to consolidate every captured position, his armored units pushed deep into enemy territory, capturing towns, cutting supply routes, and surrounding German formations before they could reorganize. Within weeks, large portions of northern France were liberated as Patton's army advanced across hundreds of miles of territory. The rapid breakout from Normandy demonstrated the power of modern armored warfare and confirmed Patton's reputation as one of the most aggressive commanders of the Allied war effort. After breaking through the German defenses in Normandy, George S. Patton's Third Army launched one of the fastest and most dramatic advances of the entire Second World War. With German forces retreating and Allied momentum building, Patton pushed his armored columns across the French countryside with relentless speed. Tanks, trucks, and mechanized infantry moved day and night, capturing towns, cutting off enemy supply routes, and forcing German units into chaotic withdrawals. The rapid advance stunned both Allied commanders and German defenders. Patton believed that momentum was the key to victory. Every hour of delay gave the enemy time to regroup, so he ordered his forces to keep moving whenever possible. American armored divisions swept across vast distances, liberating large portions of France in a matter of weeks. Cities and villages that had lived under German occupation for years suddenly saw American tanks rolling through their streets. Crowds of civilians greeted the soldiers with celebrations, marking one of the most dramatic moments of liberation in the European war. Yet the speed of Patton's advance created new challenges. Supply lines struggled to keep up with the rapidly moving front. Fuel, ammunition, and spare parts had to travel hundreds of miles across newly liberated territory. Convoys of trucks raced across France in an enormous logistical effort to keep Patton's army moving. Even the most powerful armored force could not advance without fuel, and at times, Patton's columns were forced to pause while supply units caught up. Despite these difficulties, the lightning advance across France reshaped the entire Western Front. German forces that had once held strong defensive positions were now retreating toward the borders of Germany itself. Patton's aggressive leadership had turned the Allied breakthrough into a sweeping offensive that liberated vast areas of Western Europe. The war, however, was far from over. As Allied armies approached Germany's borders, they would soon face some of the fiercest resistance of the entire conflict. In December 1944, as winter settled over Western Europe, the war took an unexpected and dramatic turn. German forces launched a massive surprise offensive through the dense forests of the Ardennes region in Belgium and Luxembourg. The operation aimed to split the Allied armies, capture the vital port of Antwerp, and force the Western Allies into negotiations. The sudden assault caught many Allied units off guard, creating a large bulge in the Allied front line that would give the battle its famous name, the Battle of the Bulge. The German attack created chaos along the front. Snowstorms and freezing temperatures limited air support, while heavily armored German units pushed through American defensive positions in an attempt to reach key road junctions deeper in Allied territory. Many American units found themselves surrounded or forced into desperate defensive battles against overwhelming numbers. The situation was critical, and Allied commanders needed a rapid response to contain the breakthrough. George S. Patton's Third Army was positioned south of the German offensive, engaged in operations along the front. When news of the German attack reached Allied headquarters, Patton immediately proposed a bold solution. In an extraordinary maneuver, he ordered his entire army to pivot northward, a complex movement involving tens of thousands of soldiers, tanks and vehicles shifting direction across icy roads and winter terrain. Within days, Patton's forces were moving toward the town of Bastogne, where American troops were surrounded by German forces. The rapid maneuver demonstrated Patton's remarkable ability to adapt to changing battlefield conditions. His army advanced through snow-covered roads and freezing weather, fighting to reach the besieged defenders of Bastogne. The arrival of Patton's forces helped stabilize the front and eventually contributed to the defeat of the German offensive. The Battle of the Bulge became one of the largest and most intense battles fought by American forces during the war. And once again, Patton's aggressive leadership played a crucial role in turning the tide. By early 1945, the war in Europe was entering its final phase. Allied armies had pushed across France and Belgium, broken through Germany's western defenses, and were now advancing toward the heart of the Third Reich itself. Among the commanders leading this final drive was General George S. Patton. His Third Army, hardened by years of combat, continued to move with the speed and aggression that had defined its operations since Normandy. Patton believed that victory required relentless pressure. Even as German resistance began to weaken, he refused to slow his advance. His armored divisions crossed rivers, captured strategic cities, and pushed deeper into German territory with remarkable momentum. The rapid advance of the Third Army liberated large areas of occupied Europe and forced German units into disorganized retreats. Patton's leadership ensured that his forces remained one of the most dynamic and mobile armies on the Western Front. In April 1945, Patton's troops reached deep into central Germany and parts of Czechoslovakia, capturing thousands of prisoners and securing vital territory before the final collapse of Nazi Germany. The war in Europe officially ended in May 1945, bringing 6 years of devastating conflict to a close. For the soldiers who had fought across deserts, mountains, and cities, the victory marked the end of an extraordinary and exhausting struggle. George S. Patton's legacy as a commander remains one of the most discussed in military history. Known for his fiery speeches, strict discipline, and aggressive battlefield tactics, he inspired both admiration and controversy. Yet few could deny the impact of his leadership. From North Africa to France and Germany, Patton demonstrated the power of speed, mobility, and decisive command. His belief in bold action shaped the operations of the Allied armies and left a lasting mark on the history of modern warfare.